Hey everyone, I just wanted to make a few comments about the Unit 6 discussion. I enjoyed reading through your comments, questions, responses, and all. Of course, this was a very difficult unit to get through in a lot of ways because what we were studying and focusing on was a period of military dictatorship um, and some reactions to that in the 80s and 90s. We also learned a lot about the U.S. role, um, either directly or sort of indirectly and implicitly, in a lot of the horrific events that took place during the various dirty wars that were waged across Latin America in the 1970s and early 1980s. Um, Before I get to some of my specific comments, I wanted to offer an extra credit opportunity if you want it. Uh, if you would like up to 50 points extra credit, you can go to the National Security Archive at George Washington University online. You can either just Google National Security Archive GWU, or you can type in nsarchive.gwu.edu. Um, and this contains a lot of declassified information from CIA, FBI, and other agencies in the United States. It includes documents relative not only to Latin America, but other areas in the world in which the United States has had an influence. Um, for extra credit, uh, go look at the archive, search for a specific, well, not a specific, but a primary document that relates to Latin America. It can be anything. So wide open as long as the document you find relates to Latin America. Read through it and then do a write-up of it. Share the URL, explain briefly what the document is, what it's about, what it deals with, so a quick summary, and then analyze it. Say, what does this mean? Or answer the question of what this means for the history of Latin America, how it relates to things that we've been studying. Um, be sure to use specific examples as you do so. Um, and you can do that for up to 50 points extra credit. Um, so yes, that is an option for you. You can submit that by responding or in your response to this video. I post it here as an announcement, but I also post it on the Unit 6 discussion forum. So respond to where this video is posted in the Unit 6 discussion forum in order to get the extra credit. And of course, if you have any questions about that, please let me know. I thought that there were a few of your questions that were really good for helping us to kind of try to wrap our heads around what Unit 6 was all about. And I want to also point out that we should keep in mind the things that we've been reading about and learning about in Unit 6 as we look toward Unit 7 and reading Alicia Partnoy's The Little School. It's not quite a nonfiction account, as you'll see. It's a kind of literary account of her experience in the little school where she was captured, placed under the control of torturers. Essentially, she and her husband were disappeared. Her daughter was taken away. She lost her in that process. And so the little school is one attempt to try to come to grips or come to terms with these horrific actions that military governments in Latin America perpetrated against their own people. So I think that's one of the big questions a lot of us had on our mind is how do we come to terms with this? How do people get justice for what has been done to them, to their family members, and so on? It's not an easy question to answer, and that's what we'll be trying to do with the little school. Also, it can be easy to sort of reduce what was going on, between about 1950 and 1990 in Latin America. It can be easy to reduce that to Cold War considerations. And say the U.S. was so bent on trying to stop communism in any way, shape, or form, even if it wasn't really there in the Western Hemisphere, that it took these horrible measures of propping up dictators and overthrowing democratically elected leaders in Latin America just to ensure that its interests in the Cold War were protected. I wouldn't go so far as to say that that didn't matter. It was just an excuse for intervention in Latin America. And the reason being, as we saw in Wood during this unit, different presidents, different administrations, different timeframes had different ways of looking at foreign policy and different ways of thinking about the Cold War. With the Truman Doctrine, what we see is that application of the Cold War to the Western Hemisphere. With the Kennedy administration, we see at least an attempt to try to reach out to Latin American nations and build them up in a way that was similar to the Marshall Plan for Europe that followed World War II, but they didn't quite go that far in terms of providing economic support for Latin American nations and so on. Other governments, the Eisenhower administration, even the Kennedy administration, at least covertly, and then certainly the Nixon administration with Henry Kissinger as Secretary of State, took very blatant actions toward destabilizing governments in Latin America that they considered to be communist regimes. Of course, we have to look at the flip side of this as well. Military establishments in Latin America, as well as some often right-wing political conservative movements in Latin America, also capitalized on the Cold War polarization in the world in order to get U.S. backing to get rid of their enemies or their opposition and return to power in places like Guatemala, Chile, Argentina, Brazil. Again, those are the kind of most blatant examples. There's also a case in Mexico after the Tlatelolco massacre where President Echeverria, who had actually been very closely involved in calling for the massacre in the previous presidential administration, when he became president himself in the early 70s, on the one hand, he made a lot of concessions to student activists, to those who were pushing for meaningful social reforms that harken back to the ideals of the Mexican Revolution. And that got him a lot of support, both domestically and internationally, looking like he's trying to heal the wounds of what happened with the huge government overreach of the massacre in 1968. But at the same time, he was kind of covertly orchestrating Mexico's own dirty war in the state of Guerrero, where in recent years we saw Los Normalistas, the 43, who were kidnapped, probably dead by now, from the teacher school at Ayotzinapa. It was in the 70s that violence was directed there against those same schools, which were places of leftist organization and agitation, demonstration, sometimes violent, sometimes not. But the point that I'm making is that the situation was complex. It changed over time. And that's what studying history can hopefully help us to understand. History doesn't simply repeat itself. It does often rhyme, as has been stated before, but conditions and contexts do matter. Things change over time. And so I would caution us against just reducing things to, it was just the Cold War, it was just the U.S. being opportunistic. There was some of that, sure. But there was a lot more going on in terms of how each nation was functioning, what was going on internally, what their relationship with the United States was. That leaves us, I think, with these questions of how President Obama has changed the tone of the conversation between the United States and Latin America. Luis shared a very good article from the Huffington Post about how Black Cubans considered Obama's visit to their island. And we have still this open question of what do we do with people like Henry Kissinger, who, it's very clear, was instrumental in ordering government interventions through the CIA in places like Chile, and even Ronald Reagan's administration supported the same thing in Guatemala and Central America during the 1980s. We have these high-level U.S. officials who essentially supported genocides. Um, Again, if not directly, indirectly, and implicitly, how do we come to terms with that? What do we do as a nation to resolve those kinds of issues? We still have these conversations in our public discourse, our political discourse. I was thinking about the case of Abu Ghraib and the debate about whether waterboarding and those kinds of techniques are enhanced interrogation or are they torture. We haven't left these things behind. And I think we might not be able to as a nation until we can uh, openly acknowledge that we have played a role in supporting torturous regimes, even supporting torture ourselves in other places in the world. Um, so, just to leave it on that horrible downer of a note, these are the kinds of questions that we'll be considering as we look at the little school over the next couple of weeks. As always, keep up the good work and please let me know if you have any questions.